Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special program. I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Director of Educational Programs for the American Civil War Museum. And today's program is a two-part program. We're going to begin with our guest author, Andrew Feiler. He will do his presentation on his book, A Better Life for Their Children. Then we'll have a break, and during this break is a good opportunity for you to purchase Mr. Feiler's book and get it signed. There'll be about a 20-minute break, and then the second part of our program will feature our panel discussion with the area organizations that are partnering with us for this program, Appomattox for Equality, Carver Price, the Moton Museum, and also we've got some members from Cumberland Middle School. So that will be the second part of the program. And before I introduce our guest author, I do want to say that we're able to do this program today because of some special supporters, some donors who provided the funds to have Mr. Feiler come here today. So it is really very often through the support of our members and our donors that allows us to do things like this, and we certainly appreciate that. I will introduce the panelists when we begin the second part of the program. But right now, I am very pleased to welcome Andrew Feiler. He is a photographer and author and fifth-generation Georgian. Having grown up Jewish in Savannah, he has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Feiler has long been active in civic life. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple not-for-profit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials and political candidates. His art is an extension of his civic values. Feiler was named Book Photographer of the Year by the Prix de la Photographie Paris in 2022 for his book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. The book also won the Prix de la Photographie Paris in 2022 Gold Medal for Documentary Book, as well as the International Photography Awards 2022 First Place for Documentary Book. It has been honored with a Bar Tour Photography Award, an Eric Hoffer Book Award, and a Book, Jacket, and Journal Award from the Association of University Presses. Photolucida named Feiler's Rosenwald School Images a 2020 Top 50 portfolio, and Photoville selected them for the 2020 edition of The Fence, an outdoor exhibition displayed internationally in 11 cities. And the solo exhibition of this work is now on tour. Feiler's work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Smithsonian, and the Atlantic, just to name a few. His prints have been displayed in galleries throughout the South, and his photographs are in public and private collections, including that of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery. So, without further ado, let's give Andrew Feiler a warm welcome.
Thank you all for coming. Given the audience, I'm going to ask a couple questions. How many people here had parents that went to a Rosenwald school? How many had parents who were a teacher in a Rosenwald school? Okay, grandparents. Anybody have attend a Rosenwald school? And who has been in a Rosenwald school? Excellent. So I'm going to start with two premises. The first premise is that the Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically reshapes the African American experience. It establishes the educational foundation that helps the civil rights movement take place when it takes place. and yet it remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. The second premise is that the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, the collaboration, the friendship, is one of the earliest examples of Black Jewish collaboration in the cause that only later becomes known as civil rights. And there's a direct connection between that collaboration between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his white beard flowing, marching hand in hand with Dr. King in the front lines, and who famously said when he marched with Dr. King, it felt like his legs were praying. And what happened in Georgia on January 5th of 2021, where after 2 months of a runoff, filmmaker John Ossoff and the Reverend Raphael Warnock, crisscrossing the state of Georgia together for 2 months, developing not just a political alliance, but a close personal friendship. And Georgia sends its first African American and its first Jewish American to the United States Senate. That is not a political statement, that is a historical statement. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Now, I'm going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. That's in northwest Georgia. Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois. If you go to downtown Springfield today, there's a 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historic Site where they have preserved the old buildings on these 4 blocks. And directly across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Ascoli, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that when he was researching the biography, he went down to Springfield and he was meeting with the superintendent of this National Historical Site, and he said, "Do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was?" And the superintendent says, "You're sitting in it." The offices of the superintendent have long been in Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. So 2 updates to that story. Number one, at that time there was not a plaque out in front of this home. Today there is a plaque. And that plaque was placed by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. The vision of the campaign is that there would be a visitor center in Chicago with Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 program states. Legislation cleared Congress at the end of 2020 requiring the National Park Service to do what's called a special resources study. That study came out last summer. And legislation was introduced late last year, and it did not clear either chamber. But when this happens, and it will happen, this will be the first component of the U.S. National Park System to honor a Jewish American. The other thing is that because of this rising notoriety around Julius Rosenwald, they're going to open up the childhood home, and the superintendent is going to have to move someplace else. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. They didn't have the term CEO back then. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he helped turn Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what only later becomes known as civil rights. And he is motivated by his Judaism. He sees America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America treats her African American citizens. And he says, I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of its people are left behind. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantel in the president's home at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. And this is a rare photograph of the 2 men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored classroom. On the cover of my book is actually an image from the restored classroom in this schoolhouse, and you can see this quilt in the back left corner. Now, these two men meet in 1911, and you have to remember 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. And public schools for African Americans, speak up a little bit? Okay. Public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so Rosenwald and Washington developed this friendship, and they keep talking. And in 1912, they create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. This is a photograph of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School. This is in Jefferson County, Kentucky, otherwise generally known as Louisville. And I want to talk about the structure of the program, because there is genius in the structure of this program. They reach out to the black communities of the South, and they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will reach out to the school system, the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating black-white dialogue as a vector for future progress, and these have to be public schools. So while we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, the school system has to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. You do those two things, and Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now think about this. The black community has to participate. This is an early example of challenge grants. The school system has to participate. This is an early example of public-private partnership. Now, I want to pause for a second and talk a little bit about this image as a photograph. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on them. And Booker T. Washington has photographs made just like this of the students and teachers standing out in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities, and he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved that he's committing to expand the program. And these images continue to be made throughout the history of the program. They become part of the history of the program. They become part of the visual language of the program. All of my bodies of work prior to this body of work have been in color, but I shot this body of work in black and white in recognition of the role that these images play in the storiosity of the way this story unfolds. So the black community has to participate, the white community has to participate. The first community to raise the matching funds is the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama. This is in 1912, and from 1912 until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, the program builds 4,978 schools, and the results are transformative. Now, I'm going to talk about transformation in a second, but let me talk a little bit about my process. My process is extremely research intensive. I read and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting, and the shooting informs the reading. And I'm going to tell you one particular story that illustrates that. I read, in the course of doing this research, beside reading a lot of books and a lot of articles, there are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I read 50 of those National Register nomination forms, and I knew how valuable they are because I've written one. In 2013, my wife and I stumbled on this old industrial building in Atlanta, and as everybody knows, you scratch below the surface in the South and you don't know whether you're going to be dealt a saint or a sinner, and you're more likely to be dealt a sinner. We got dealt a saint. How many people here are familiar with convict leasing? So in one of the worst features of the Jim Crow era was creating trumped-up charges on poor African Americans and leasing them out to heavy manufacturers. In Alabama, it tended to be in the steel industry. In places like Louisiana and Texas, it was sugar. In places like Georgia, it was the brick industry. And we now live in the building that housed the brick company where the person whose name is above the door of our home led the effort to overturn the convict leasing system in Georgia. So I've written this nomination form, and I knew how valuable they were. And the story I'm about to tell you comes from the nomination form of the Eleanor Roosevelt School. 1929, President Roosevelt sees a Rosenwald school in Meriwether County. This is Warm Springs, Georgia. And he calls up the Rosenwald Fund, Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and he says, we need another Rosenwald school in Meriwether County. Well, it's 1929. The recession has set in. The school system's unable to contribute. The black community is unable to contribute. And the idea languishes. Now, in 1929, Franklin Roosevelt is not yet president. 1937, Franklin Roosevelt picks up the phone again and he calls Edwin Embry. He says, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago. So actually from 1912 to 1932, they built 4,977 schools. So Edwin Embry says to President Roosevelt, well, Mr. President, the program ended 5 years ago. But for you, Mr. President, and they agree to build one last Rosenwald school. The black community contributes, the white school system contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office reporting to President Roosevelt, who asks about the progress on the school, and he reports to the president that they're $1,000 short. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap. And later that year, he presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School. Now, I said the results of this program were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II, and the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrated Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. And decided that in 1995 it was safe to go back to the South. So I'm coming up on 30 years back in Atlanta. For 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's. So I reached out to Congressman Lewis and asked if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. I said, Congressman, I will have an essay in this book. There'll be 2 essays in this book by prominent African-American preservationists. We will have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What was your day like? What was that education like? What role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I could do that. So it was on October 29th of 2019, I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office, sitting around this round table in the middle of his space. It actually really served as his desk. And we were working on the introduction, and at the end, he takes his hand and he slams it down on the table, and he says, it's perfect, don't change a word. And he stands up, and his jacket has been drooped behind the chair. And he puts the jacket on, and he says, should I take this cancer awareness ribbon off? And I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you, leave it on. And it was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with the pancreatic cancer diagnosis that would take his life the next year. This is the last formal portrait made of Congressman Lewis. This is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest known surviving Rosenwald school, and the only known surviving example of one of the first two designs for Rosenwald schools. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015, and I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and she's the first person to tell me about Rosenwald schools, and the story shocked me. I'm a fifth-generation Jewish Georgian. I've been a civic activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I came home and I Googled it, and I found that while there were some books on academic books on the topic, there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program, so I set out to do exactly that. And over the next 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. Of the original 4,978 schools, only about 500 survive. Only half of those have been restored, and I shot 105 of the surviving schools. And the result is this book and an exhibition. And for those of you here, there's two exhibition sets. One's in Texas right now, but the other set is at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, where it's on view through Easter, April 21, April 20, or April 21. I think it's April 20. And they have done, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture has done an amazing job of finding a lot of local content, Virginia content, to broaden the telling of the Virginia Rosenwald School story. So I highly recommend the exhibition. So what I want to do is I want to take you inside this schoolhouse and talk about the architecture. To do that, I have to tell you the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor is the first African American to attend MIT, the first accredited African American architect. He's hired by Booker T. Washington to become the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which is today which is its own National Historic Site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus are designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. I forgot to add one critical detail. Robert Robinson Taylor is the great-great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in public policy circles in Chicago and a principal advisor to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House. So Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects that lay out the architectural principles of the Rosenwald schools, these large banks of 9/9 pane windows on the left to let in lots of light, because these schoolhouses would not have originally had electricity. Cloakrooms on the right, so that dirty outer garments can be kept out of the education spaces and the education spaces kept cleaner. Brick chimneys to vent the potbelly stoves that would have kept the schoolhouse warm on colder days. And toward the back of this space, you see this room divider. That room divider would have originally had in it a series of doors that can be closed off to separate the education spaces during education hours, or accordioned back to create a unified community center space for use outside of education hours. And these basic principles persist throughout the entire history of the Rosenwald's program. They become part of the history of the program. This is progressive era architecture in the cause of education. Now, this is actually what's known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school, the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. James Hope was the state superintendent, school superintendent in South Carolina, who was so committed to the Rosenwald Schools program, every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald schools. And the Hope family all but donated. They actually sold for $5, which even in 1926 was basically a donation. They sold 2 acres of land for the schoolhouse, and in appreciation, the community named the school after him. The schoolhouse, when it closed in 1954, fell into disrepair. And in the 1990s, Ron Hope, the grandnephew of James Hope, is a career Army officer, retires back to Newberry County, South Carolina, and he says, I'm on a pension from the U.S. government, from the people of the United States. What can I do to give back? He single-handedly restored this schoolhouse. And if you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. So this is 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the basic architectural guidelines of the Rosenwald program was that the schoolhouses were to be modest. That was in part to save cost, and in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, of the local white citizenry. But there was a more specific dictate that I affectionately call the no doodads rule, which was no cupolas. Fletcher Dressler, who was the architectural reviewer for the Rosenwald program, he was a professor at George Peabody School in Nashville, which is now part of Vanderbilt, believed that a cupola, that little thing on the top is a cupola, was derivative of church architecture, and that on a schoolhouse it violated separation of church and state. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. In fact, of the 105 Rosenwald schools that I went to, 3 of them have cupolas, including one that we actually know Julius Rosenwald specifically visited, one in Fort Valley, Georgia. Remember, the African American community has to participate, and they count cash, land, material, or labor. This African American community won a cupola, and they built a cupola. This is African American Community Agency in 1926, Jim Crow, North Carolina. Now, think about it. 1-teacher schools, 2-teacher schools, 3-teacher schools, these small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. In fact, there are several members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central, who come out of Dunbar prior to going to Little Rock Central, which is about a mile away. And if this Art Deco architecture looks vaguely familiar, it's because the architect of Dunbar was the architect of Little Rock Central. Now, I knew this was an extraordinary story. It was not clear from the beginning, how do you tell it visually? And I started out shooting these schools, this architectural narrative, 1-teacher schools, 2-teacher schools, 3-teacher schools. You know, by the end of this program, you've got buildings of this magnitude. But when I found out that only 10% of the schools survived, and only half of those had survived, I realized that the historic preservation story was a huge part of this story. The adaptive reuse story was an important part of this story. And in order to tell that story, I had to get inside. And to get inside, suddenly I needed permission. And that's when I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, and I bring their stories into this broader narrative with portraits. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters. This is in Cass County, Texas. 3 of these women, go back to how I started this conversation, 3 of these women have parents who went to a Rosenwald school. 3 of these women went to a Rosenwald school, and LaJoyce Flanagan, who's in the front row in the center, was a teacher in this school. And when the schoolhouse closed and it fell into disrepair, these women made it their cause to restore this schoolhouse. And they started quilting, and they sold these quilts to raise the money to create what is now the Pleasant Hill Community Center. And these women gather most Mondays in the schoolhouse to quilt. And I'll just add, I commissioned them to do a quilt for us, and it's our bedspread at home. This is the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, another example of a community center. Notice the pressed tin that covers all the walls and ceilings of this schoolhouse, another extraordinary example of the pride that this community had in its schoolhouse. This is the Denby School in Warwick County, Virginia. As some of you may know, all the county names changed. This is the old name. But Beatrice Combs attended this schoolhouse. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1959, she and her husband purchased the schoolhouse and promptly got into a fight. He wanted to turn it into a bar. She said, "Over my dead body." And it's a two-teacher school, so they rented it out to two families. And Beatrice Combs joined an evangelical church that was meeting in a strip mall. And in the words of her daughter, she accepted the Lord, and they arranged for the church to start meeting in the schoolhouse. The church thrives. They add on to it. And Beatrice Combs was a member of this church. She was the secretary of the church and an usher at this church her entire life. Her children and grandchildren are still members of this church today. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of, about this schoolhouse and a little bit more about my process. You can see that these schoolhouses have a linearity to them, but they don't have the aspect ratio of a 35 millimeter image is 3:2. That is not the aspect ratio of a Rosenwald school. So if you're photographing these, you're going to have either foreground or sky if you're on the outside. And so I was looking, and that's one thing. And the second thing is, I would get on Google Maps and I would see which direction does the schoolhouse face. Because if it faces east, I need to be there in the morning, or I need a cloudy day, or it's going to be in shadow. So I was often looking for cloudy days. And but since I was also off driving for long sweeps of these in shooting, couldn't necessarily control the weather. So I could control whether I was there in the morning or the afternoon. So this schoolhouse faces west. And I knew from the way it laid out that I need clouds in the sky. And I'm in Washington, D.C., so I drive down, and I know the weather report says that at 2 o'clock there's going to be clouds, but it's going to be sunny before then. So I have to be back in Washington for dinner that night. I get down there at 10:30, and indeed, the schoolhouse is in shadow, it's bright blue sky, and at about 1:30 the clouds start to come in. This is not always so fortunate. I was recently trying to take a photograph in the rain, and it was supposed to rain at 2, and then it became 3, and then it became 4, and it didn't end up raining till 11 o'clock at night, which is too late for the image. So at about 5 minutes to 2, I'm like, okay, 5 minutes, I'm going to take this picture. And a van pulls up and parks right in front of the church addition. So I'm on actually about 6 lanes of traffic is between me and them. I get in the car, I go across there, I knock on the door. It's the pastor. I tell him why I'm there, and he could not have been nicer. He brings me inside, he shows me around, he brings me into the Rosenwald School, tells me the story of Beatrice Combs. Her portrait hangs above the doorway of the old schoolhouse, which is now the Beatrice Combs Fellowship Hall. And he introduces me to the daughter, and when this exhibition originated at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, 2 of her children and their children came down to see the exhibition. This is an example of the windows that are the iconic features of Rosenwald School architecture. This is the St. Paul's Chapel School in Brunswick County, Virginia. And a portrait of Abraham Lincoln that hangs on the wall of the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee. And just the names of these schools are poetic. Warfield was the person in the community. There was a pre-existing schoolhouse. It was kind of a shack in Montgomery County, Tennessee. Looks like I'm not sure if I'm not sure where that came from, but we'll get rid of that. There we go. That was destroyed by a tornado. And Warwick was the man of the community that coordinated the fundraising effort to create the match that allowed them to do the Rosenwald School. But many of these schools are in disrepair. This is the Hannah School across the street from the Hannah AME Church, namesake for the schoolhouse. And you see that the graveyard of the church has grown up around the schoolhouse. And in the kind of detail you can never make up, the schoolhouse rises on Deadfall Road. But you see the schoolhouse is in great disrepair. And these places, these spaces, are the locus of history and memory in a community. And when we lose places and spaces like this, we lose a piece of the American soul. And that's why this historic preservation imperative is so important. And indeed, there were times on this journey, this is the Nansemond School in Nansemond County, Virginia, which is now Suffolk, where I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by emergency fencing or yellow caution tape. This is the price of not taking care of our historic resources. But as I said, what becomes the heart and soul of this journey are the people that I met along the way. This is inside the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs above the doorway has hung there since this schoolhouse opened in 1923. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. Both of them went to this school. Both of them went to college. Both of them went to graduate school. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. The two men have 4 sisters, all of whom went through this school, all of whom went to college. And these 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened were it not for this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Spring School in Forest County, Mississippi. This is the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr.'s grandfather donated the 2 acres of land for the school, and Vernon Damer was a student in this schoolhouse. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958, the grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause, so the property reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned it into a locus of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And when Vernon Damer drove African Americans into Hattiesburg, Mississippi to attempt to register to vote, he was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, Mississippi. He would have the people park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. All of this activity drew the ire, as you can imagine, of the KKK, and Vernon Damer and his wife, who lived in this home just behind the trees on the right of this schoolhouse, on the night of January 6th, 1964, January 10th, 1964, the house was firebombed by the KKK. And Vernon Damer stood in the window of his living room with a gun trying to hold the attackers off while his wife Ellie got their children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries in that fire. This is Ellie Damer. This is inside the Bay Spring School. Ellie Damer went to a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi. She went off to college. She came back. She taught in this schoolhouse. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, because the state of Mississippi had built a larger, consolidated, segregated school, do the math, 4 years after Brown v. Board, the state of Mississippi is building new, segregated schools. Ellie Damer was denied employment at that new school because of her husband's activism, and she had to get a job in a school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for the next 21 years. She is still alive. She's 99 years old, and she lives in the home that was built on the remnants of the firebombed home where a historic marker stands guard. This is the last school I'm going to share. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the time that I was out shooting this work, it was in the last throes of being restored. In November of 2022, I was there. I keynoted their celebration of the 100th anniversary of the schoolhouse. And this is inside the schoolhouse. This is Elroy and Sophia Williams. I'm trying to get rid of this little box. There we go. Okay. The portrait in the middle of this image is from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald. They were both born into slavery. Upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land. They acquired some more land. They eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County in 1919, they donated 2 acres of the land for the school. The school's first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Elroy Williams on the left went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. The two of them went off to college. They came back. They had an entire career as educators, and they have led the restoration, first the preservation. Elroy has these incredible stories of nailing tin down on top of the roof to try to at least protect the schoolhouse and the prairie winds blowing the tin off. But you see that the texture on the wall, that's primer. There's plastic sheeting on the floor. The potbelly stove on the right is wrapped. And of course, this restoration was successful, and it's now been turned into a community center and museum. And I'll just add, if there's an exhibition of this work up at the Bullock, Texas State History Museum in Austin, and the family loaned to them the photograph that's being held here in this portrait. But I found these stories time and time again. Former teachers becoming preservationists, becoming the keepers of history and memory in a community. And I found these extraordinary stories of Rosenwald schools connected to these critical moments in American history. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, the Trail of Tears, the litigation of Brown v. Board, murder, embezzlement. And so I ended up writing a short story that goes with each of the images, and that's what's in the book. Now, this is a book about Rosenwald schools, but there's another component of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy, which is too important to leave out, and that was the Rosenwald Fellowships. From 1928 to 1948, the Rosenwald Fellowships supported intellectuals and creatives across America. 278 of those grants went to liberal white Southerners, like newspaper editor Ralph McGill or playwright Lillian Smith. But 587 of them went to a veritable who's who of 20th century African American intellectuals and creatives. James Weldon Johnson, Marian Anderson, Langston Hughes, the Clarks, and it's really extraordinary in its scope, as Zora Neale Hurston. It's very extraordinary in its scope and sweep. And the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant was Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks, who ultimately becomes the first African-American photographer on the staff of Life magazine. Gordon Parks has long been an inspiration for my work because it was from Gordon Parks, who famously said that his camera was his choice of weapon. It is from Gordon Parks that I learned that art could be activism. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror, and roll forward to our time in Atlanta, and his daughter Leslie is a friend of ours. So I reached out to Leslie, and I said, Leslie, I've got this idea. I want to do this portrait. I want to tell the Rosenwald Fellowship story through your dad, and I got this idea maybe you could be hugging a photograph done by your dad. She says, that's a great idea. And she puts me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation that immediately emails me this self-portrait. And they say this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks' application to the Rosenwald Fund. I said, that will do. And they send it to me, and I get it framed, and we go and do this photograph. But two things I want to say about it. Gordon Parks at the time was basically doing portraiture and fashion photography in the south side of Chicago. He is placed by the Rosenwald Fund at the Farm Security Administration under Roy Stryker. And Roy Stryker is this towering figure in the history of documentary photography. He runs this unit as part of the New Deal inside the Farm Security Administration, documenting both the predicament of rural America and the work of the New Deal agencies. And it is this incredible collection of photographers. You will all recognize the image of migrant mother holding several of her children. That was a FSA image by photographer Dorothea Lange. But Carl Meidens, who wins a Pulitzer Prize for his ultimately for his work as a photojournalist in the Vietnam War, Walker Evans, these are all towering figures in photography. And Gordon Parks is placed with the Farm Security Administration. And Roy Stryker says to Gordon Parks, go downtown to this department store. He goes to Washington, D.C., go downtown and buy a coat. Gordon Parks goes down, he tries to buy a coat, he's thrown out of the store. He comes back and he's fuming. And Roy Stryker says to Gordon Parks, shoot your anger. Later that week, he's working late at night, and he sees this woman cleaning the offices of this government office building. And you all know the photograph. In front of a 48-star American flag, African-American woman with a mop in one hand and a broom in the other, American Gothic. He brings this photograph back to Roy Stryker, who says, "Are you trying to get us fired?" That image is not seen in public for years because it was considered so controversial. But Gordon Parks becomes Gordon Parks because of the Rosenwald Fellowship. So I'm going to close this portion of our conversation this afternoon with a personal observation. I come to this work as an activist. And as I reflect on this story, there's two things that jump out at me. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African American children in 1912, deeply segregated, deeply Jim Crow America. That is an extraordinarily optimistic act. That is a multi-generational act. And I find great power in this combination of optimism and long-term thinking. And indeed, for everything he had been through, this was actually the heart of Congressman Lewis's philosophy. He would say with extraordinary frequency, "Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our work is not the work of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the work of a lifetime." So I'll close with the refrain of Congressman Lewis's most fervent call: be optimistic, think long term, and indeed make good trouble. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. So I'm researching a community that had a Rosenwald school in it. It was torn down, and we struggled to find any information on it. How did you go about doing your research for knowing where these schools were? I guess that's the shortest version of the question.
Yeah. So a couple answers to your question. First of all, Jeannie Syriac, who's the woman from whom I learned about Rosenwald School, would scoff at the idea that I had the internet, because she drove all over Georgia. She ended up finding 37 Rosenwald schools that survived and getting them collectively listed. What's called a multi-site listing on the National Register, so that if somebody found another Rosenwald school, they could just tag it onto that. It made it much easier to get it listed. And she thought the fact that I had the internet was like cushy. There's actually more on the internet now. Like there's like a surprising number of Rosenwald schools that survive. These ones that survive, if you type them into like Google Maps, they'll like show up. That wasn't happening when I was out there. But I think there's two really significant sources. One is the National Park Service website for National Register nomination forms. The states have had to the state historic preservation offices are responsible for digitizing those assets. So in some states, the digitized version is not available, and you have to go through the SHPO to get those forms. But those are incredibly informative. The other is that the archives of the Rosenwald Fund are at Fisk University. Now, when I was out and about doing this work, there was kind of a rudimentary database. They had gotten a grant in 2002 from the National Trust to digitize the basic records. So you could search by county, and it would pull up the basic record on a school, which is what year it was funded, what size school it was, how much money came from how much money it cost, and how much of that came from Rosenwald versus the black community versus the white community versus the local school system. They have, the last 2 years, they've been digitizing everything, and for some inexplicable reason, they took down the previous database. And so there's actually been various times that I've had to I needed some information because of some talk I was giving or a museum exhibition that was going on, and I just simply have to call them and ask. But it's supposed to be back up sometime the first half of this year. I actually just checked for somebody 2 weeks ago, and it is not back up yet, and I can report that. But they're the critical resource, and eventually you'll be able to search that database, again, by state and by county, and which is at least a place to get you started.
And I can suggest that Preservation Virginia, for the multiple property document for Rosenwald schools in Virginia, did a survey with Department of Historic Resources 10 years ago, and Preservation Virginia has an interactive map of Virginia and all the counties and all the Rosenwald schools. You have seen that?
I think I've seen it. It's so that there's, the only history I think that's listed is that it was torn down. It gives the date to put up a park, and then the park was never built. Like, it's
Okay.
literally, that's as much information. Like, I know it exists. I know we knew about it. I know where it's at on the map. Like, we drive by it when I go to the church. But I just wanted to know.
That's a start, but
Yeah.
this would be your best.
But that said, your point's very well taken. The statewide and local preservation organizations, the Texas Historical Commission, for example, has also done a study of Texas Rosenwald schools, and it's a terrific resource. So the Preservation Virginia data is often very helpful. In this case, maybe it's not. But in general, those types of, basically the organizations that are affiliated with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in any state are generally really good resources. And you can also reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office that will have somebody whose role it is to focus on African American heritage and history,
Okay.
and they may have some information as well.
Would county records have that for the school board participating in with that?
You can try that. I have not. I haven't.
Okay.
That would make some sense.
Yeah.
Whether those records have been preserved, that's a different question, and I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Were there any special teaching techniques came out of the Rosenwald school system?
So the Rosenwald Fund was silent on curriculum. It was really focused on infrastructure. And there was a debate in this time that is basically framed by this debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington believed in what was called industrial education, which today we would call vo-tech, because he thought that that was the path to economic stability, which was a precursor for a greater push for civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in what he called the talented 10th, which was to educate in sort of classical education, reading, writing, arithmetic, to create a leadership class within the black community that could essentially press for what becomes known as civil rights. That debate plays out very differently in different geographies. The closer you are to cities, the more the parents demand classical education. But if you go back to, I'm going to go back to, oh, there we go. This is a particular type of model of the Rosenwald School. This was a two-teacher school. The classrooms on the right and left were traditional classrooms. So this, one of them, for example, would likely have had classes 1 through 4 in one room, classes 5 through grades 5 through 8 in the other classroom. But this window up front, that was a room for industrial education. Some schoolhouses got rid of the industrial education and still used it as an additional room for classical education. But that tension exists throughout this era. But the Rosenwald Fund did not take a position on that. Now, with the Rosenwald, to give you an example of the Rosenwald Fund's the kinds of things it did prioritize, in 1928, after they built a large number of these schools, it's not having the impact that they want it to have. And so they pivot and they slow down funding of schools, and they start incentivizing certain other things. They incentivize longer school days, they incentivize libraries, they incentivize school buses. And they also start contributing more to HBCUs because they need more teachers. But they stayed away from the debates about curriculum. Yes, sir.
Has this project changed your life at all?
Yes. I think in a couple of ways. I'll tell you the story. Brent Leggs is the founder of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust. This is leading entity in preserving African American historical spaces. He wrote the afterword to my book. I was invited to sit down with the photography curator at the National Portrait Gallery, and she explains to me that the National Portrait Gallery has this unusual criteria. It can't just be a good portrait, the person has to be important in the sweep of American history. So I literally sit with her, I go through every photograph in the book. Teachers are important, preservationists are important, and we get down to the very end in the last photograph in the book, because it's the afterword is Brent Leggs. She says, that I'm interested in. So they have to send it to a panel of historians who decide that it qualifies. I then have to send them the physical print. The photography curators have to get together and say that it qualifies. Then it goes to the board, which apparently is not pro forma. They actually have, they reject nominations sometimes. And on the Monday after Thanksgiving in November a year ago, I get an email at 5:27 in the afternoon that it has become part of the permanent collection. I have not told Brent any of this. So I text Brent. I said, I know we're having dinner next week, but I got to talk to you. I got something important to tell you. He's like, I'm walking out of a meeting, I'll call you in 15 minutes. So I go through this whole long version of the story with him without telling him about his picture. I was like, this criteria and blah, blah, blah. And I said, as of 5:27 this afternoon, my portrait of you is in the National Portrait Gallery. And he starts to cry. And I start to cry. Because to him, it's such an incredible affirmation of the work that he's doing. And as he said, this is a bond that he and I will share forever. But when I said to Brent, and the reason I tell the story is I said, Brent, this is not hyperbole. This will be in my obituary. Because the obituary of any artist, the second paragraph is what permanent collections are they in, because it's an affirmation of their work. And so I'm now, two things about this. The way this work evolved, and it didn't start out that way, it evolved. It's black and white images that link history with contemporary issues, and I write a story that goes with each image. I got a history background. There's a lot of photographers that could do the photography that couldn't necessarily do the writing, and there's a lot of writers that could do the writing and couldn't necessarily do the photography. What I can uniquely contribute to photography is this combination. And so I'm working on this new project now to surface undertold stories from diverse communities in America. And I have, we talk about political capital, I have cultural capital, and I'm going to spend it. I'm not going to sit on it. And I'm using it, and I was, courtesy of the Ranger staff, some of whom are here today, I was at Appomattox Courthouse this morning shooting a photograph of the surrender room to tell the story of Ely Parker, a Native American who was in the surrender room and who has a really interesting historical interaction with General Lee. And so the fact that folks like that can say yes to my inquiries is because of the success and the degree to which this work has been embraced. And so I get to go forth and tell other stories. And my work in the end is really about bringing people into stories, using images to bring people into stories that they would not otherwise have access to. And I get to do the work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
So through the Rosenwald schools, there have been, I know just throughout the history of just like civil rights, many other people have been called into action. So you talk about how like Rosenwald himself was a Jewish American, and she felt that how many other people of different minorities actually came through this whole entire experience? Because I also talked about Eli Parker.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, like, what is the breadth of like how has this happened? Women, how has this helped women? How has this helped people from just like different backgrounds?
You talking about Rosenwald schools?
Yeah.
Well, I think the broader answer to your question is this. And this is actually the subject of my first photography book that came out in 2015. It's a portrait of an abandoned college campus. And I use this disconnect between the familiarity of education spaces and the veneer of abandonment to talk about the role of education in America. Education has been the backbone of the American dream, the on-ramp to the American middle class, since before there was the United States of America. the first taxpayer-funded school was created in Dedham, Massachusetts in 1644. That's how far back our commitment to public education goes. And there's a connection between that, the earliest colleges founded in America, which are in the 17th century. The Land Grant College Act, which creates colleges all across America, is 1862. HBCUs, predominantly in the decades after the Civil War. Rosenwald schools, early decades of the 20th century. The educational provisions of the GI Bill transform America from relatively poor to relatively prosperous. Brown versus Board of Education is one of the high water marks of the Civil Rights Movement. What are we talking about today? Right? Crushing levels of college debt, college access barriers. There's a 375 plus year tradition in America of education being the on-ramp to the American middle class, and that is now a tradition at risk. And that's, I think, what we have to think about to make sure that that continues to be part of the American dream.
Well, I think I see one hand. We'll do one last question.
Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you. The title of the book is so suggestive to me, A Better Life for Their Children. I am an activist myself also, and as my two grandchildren, they're 2 and 4, grow, increasingly them becomes, for me, one of the greatest incentive to the work and the ministry that I do. So from the work that you've done, could you, and it's related to one of the questions asked before, for you, what would be 1 or 2 lessons that you get from that context that we can apply in the context we're living today?
Yeah. So I'd say, so one thing I would say is this. Let's remember, Booker T. Washington and Julius, we like to believe, we sometimes believe that problems are intractable in America, especially those related to race. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington in 1912 America are reaching across divides of race, divides of religion, divides of region, and they fundamentally change America for the better. And I think the simple lesson there is that individual actions matter. What we do matters. And so I think that stay engaged, be on the battlefield. I think that's in itself the most important message. But then I go back to how I closed my talk. I do think that there is great power in being an optimist and thinking long term. Because these problems are going to be here long after we are not. Those grandchildren of yours, they're going to have to fight the battles of when they become adults. And I think that keeping that orientation in mind, that we have to play long ball, is an important thing to keep in mind.
Well, thank you so much. That was excellent. All right. Well, welcome back. And there does seem to be a little bit of a ring, doesn't there? Is that as good as it's going to get? Should I be further away?
No, I think you're fine.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome back, and I'm excited about this second part of our program because we're going to get to hear from local experts. We're going to get to hear from people who actually attended and been involved with Rosenwald schools. So I'm going to introduce the members of our panel, and I didn't know how everybody was going to sit, so I've got, I'm looking at how to do this. But down here, we're going to start on the side that's closest to me, and I'm going to introduce Monroe Preston. He attended a Rosenwald school, grades 1 through 7, and had Mrs. Meredith Stewart, a Tuskegee University Institute graduate, as a teacher. He facilitated the Glade Springs School Historical Highway Marker. And Preston graduated from Patrick Henry High School and the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. And after 31 years with Crossroads Services Mental Health Board, Mr. Preston retired and coached the Cumberland High School golf team for 10 years. Mr. Preston is a member and trustee at Beulah AME Church in Farmville, Virginia. And then right next to him, we have Lou Longnecker. He teaches at Cumberland Middle School and serves as the social studies master teacher for Cumberland County Public Schools. Longnecker, a Bethany College, West Virginia graduate, has taught world geography, Virginia United States history, civics, and economics, and United States history too throughout his 20-plus teaching career. And in recent years, he has developed curricula for the Library of Virginia, Virginia Humanities, Virginia Schools Consortium for Learning, and the AMMD Pine Grove Project, emphasizing student inquiry and primary source analysis with a focus on Indigenous history, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and responses to Jim Crow and early public education. And then we have Jotricia Humbles. Jotricia Humbles is the lead agent of Appomattox for Equality and a licensed mental health professional. She's a native of Appomattox and has been able to trace her family history to Appomattox Courthouse, now National Park, in which 5 of her ancestors were freed on April 9th, 1865. Jotricia is passionate about learning, not only about her own family legacy, but the amazing legacy of the African American community that helped shape her hometown. And then we have Leah Brown. She is the Associate Director for Education and Collections at the Robert Russo Moton Museum. Brown joined Moton's team in 2019 as Assistant Director for Education, transitioning to Associate Director in 2022, specializing in American history with an emphasis on Virginia. And prior to her appointment at Moton, Brown served as the digital outreach educator for the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, a museum educator at the U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum, and a senior tour counselor at the Virginia Tourism Corporation. Brown attended North Carolina State University, where she obtained a master's in public history in 2014. And then we have Darlene Reed. She is the Vice President of the Carver Price Alumni Association. Her love of history and her connection to the school led her to her involvement with the Carver Price Legacy Museum. And Darlene's grandparents were supporters of the school, and her siblings attended the school, and she did as well before integration. So welcome to our panelists. And we had a conversation to discuss just some of the things that we wanted to bring to light with this panel discussion. And one thing that we talked about is how the importance of education has always been important to Black Virginians. And there was emphasis on this even before the Rosenwald schools were created. So I'm going to open the conversation up by just asking anyone on the panel who wants to share about some of those early educational endeavors before Rosenwald schools.
Well, I'd like to share that, even with my grandparents and my sisters and brothers that attended the schools, listening to the stories tell you the struggles that as African Americans, our parents made sacrifices for us so that we could get that education. My grandparents made a way for students to get a school. They purchased a school bus, and the county paid them for mileage. And my uncles and them, they were the ones that drove the bus. They actually, would pick up students, to take them to the schools, so that was some of the things that here in this community, a lot of the people don't know that, those were some of the things that they went through. Some had to walk to school, even though we had the different schools in each, I guess, community. We had the different one-room schools, and a lot of them were the Rosenwald schools.
And what was it like going to a Rosenwald school?
I guess it was, know, for them, it was good because, you know, they got to further their education, you know, so that they could be what they wanted to be. You know, the teachers back then, from what, you know, we were told, that the teachers told them they could be whatever they wanted to be. You know, you just don't settle. You know, so, and even when I went to the school there, you know, it was, we didn't have the potbelly stove, but, you know, the one that we own in Stout Spring, the church owns the Rosenwald School. We still actually have the potbelly stove there, and you can see how the room, it was just one big room, and it was actually like one of the schools that was in his picture, the school in Georgia. You know, you did have it, it was sectioned off. You know, you had one big room and then it was two other rooms in the back. So, you know, it's kind of neat to know that.
And Monroe, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, the school that I went to in Southwest Virginia, pretty close down to where Bristol is, if you know where Bristol is. And it was really comfortable to us because the teachers, it was right in the heart of the community. In fact, there probably everybody walked to school. Everybody carried their lunch. We didn't have a cafeteria. The books were old. You know, they were the books that was hanging down from the white schools. But the teacher, she mentioned her name, Meredith Stewart. After I started doing research and all, found out that she used to tell us about going to school and knowing Booker T. Washington. And, you know, and she talked about how he looks and the influence that he had on her. And the influence that she had on us, she always told us to be proud of who we were and whatever job we got. And I remember her saying, if you are digging a ditch, you be the best ditch digger around. And I always remember that, you know. And and the way she carried herself, she carried herself with dignity. The way she walked, you knew it was something special about this lady. And yeah, I can talk about it some more, but I give somebody else a chance.
I'm going to circle back to the beginning question as to, like, what did education look for both enslaved and free people? I think something that people don't know, even though there was 4,600 enslaved people here in Appomattox, there was over 120 that were freed. And my family, even though 5 were freed on April 9th, the majority of my family was actually freed 1740. An ancestor bought his freedom and his family. But 2 prominent members, if you ever go down to Appomattox Courthouse Historical Park, 2 names that are very prominent down there is John Robertson, who lives in the Kelly House, who I do believe had 18 kids. I know we have some park rangers from down there here. They can tell me if I'm wrong or not. And Charles Dugood. And between the 2 of them, when the civil, they always focused on education for their kids. So I think that was always something that they knew, that being knowledgeable, whether it was through trade or classic education, that was going to be the foundation to prosper, make you productive, and help support your family. In 1870, there was a Freedmen Bureau school developed here in Appomattox, and one of the one of the things that was I find very ironic, because Leah and I have talked, and I've talked about this before. The Freedom Bureau School, they have records, and it was not welcomed here. The teacher was threatened. The students who went were threatened. One thing about the Freedom Bureau schools was it just wasn't open to African Americans. White Caucasian families recognized that, especially if you were poor, there wasn't an opportunity to educate. So I think that education component, I feel really propelled to what we have now as our public school system. Charles Duguid, who kind of helped fund that school in 1870, because of such turmoil and conflict, he packed his family up and moved to Ohio just because he wanted his kids to be educated. I'm going to kind of speak on Leah's territory a little bit. Israel Hill on Appomattox. The most I find ironic, if you look at the history of education in this area. That was a village of like 400 African Americans that had their own community. They were actually paid more than the Caucasian people who had the same jobs. They were supported, they were valued. But if we fast forward to segregation and Jim Crow and Brown versus education, Prince Edward was the community after so many years prior to that was supportive of the African American community, shut down their education because they didn't want to integrate. And I find that, I wish I could find somebody who lived at both times, which I know I can't find them. But I want to know what was the change in the mindset in that community. So, Langston Hughes, who was funded by the Rosenwald Foundation, his great-grandfather or grandfather, one of those, he was the first African-American elected politician in the state of Virginia, and guess where he lived? He covered the Prince Edward Louisa district, and he won because Caucasians thought he was the most valid candidate and actually filed a lawsuit to get him. And he actually, they really started that foundation from that to what we see in the state of Virginia as our public school system. So I feel like the importance and the fight for education that the African American community has and always has is truly the foundation of what we see today. And it's unfortunately that a lot of people don't take heed of knowing that legacy, and I do feel that's kind of a lost conversation for, I'm a mother. I have 2 teenagers who are perturbed that they're even here today. They get the lecture. I'm a mental health professional. My clients get the lecture that I feel like their education is kind of where they start to build that confidence. And I just feel like that's a missing, I'm not saying I shouldn't say it's a missing component. I feel like some of definitely low socioeconomical communities and places, that's really hard to present and engage and encourage. My parents, my whole family, education was important, and it goes back to as long as you are the best at what you are, it doesn't matter what you're doing. And I think society has kind of made if you're not this, then you're not successful. But it doesn't, we all need every job, every person to make our community and our country to be rich and successful.
Leah, did you want to build on that and talk a little bit about Moten's role?
Yeah, so at the Moten Museum, to me, as the education and collections person, we start in Reconstruction. I'm obsessed with Reconstruction because what is it to make the Union? Who's in the Union? Whose voice matters? The heart of our conversation is citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? With that 14th Amendment expectation of equal protection. How it worked, how it didn't work, and the chaos that happened afterwards. When I think about education and Reconstruction, I think about Black parents saying, okay, we won the war, we're going to reconstruct this world, we're going to make our freedom with education as central. We need the state to pay for that. That's a state level right, pay for our taxes. So you're seeing Black agency, Black expectation, Black citizenship. Also, you're going to go to school. Education gives their children options. So having that understanding of how and why Black parents asked and advocated for that, that gives the expectation. Now at Moten, the schools were closed for 5 years. And it's like, what? You could do that? Yes, if you change the laws, of course you can. So the story of Moten is a story of Black agency and Black power to get the schools even built. We think about the Martha Forrester Council of Women purchasing the building to be the museum, but also in 1920, the Council of Colored Women advocating and asking for the Farmville Elementary School, a Rosenwald school, to be built. I haven't found it yet, so wish me luck. Apparently there's a letter from Martha Forrester to Moten, or our Moten, to say like, hey, we need a building, fix it. You're from here, help home folk. So that dynamic of Black women coming together to advocate and plan, the whole council's focus was educational uplift, racial uplift, and educational access. So their tenants had the framework for everything else that happened later in Prince Edward County.
And Lou, would you want to, oh, Darlene, yes, go.
And to piggyback on that, when the schools closed in Farmville, a lot of those students went to other schools or they went to other families. You know, Carver Price was part of that. You know, a lot of those students came to Carver Price. They went to Cumberland. They went to Charlotte Courthouse. Parents, the Black parents made sure that their children were going to get some form of education. A lot of times during that time when the schools closed in Farmville, parents opened up their homes. And I was part of that when they had a panel discussion at Longwood with some of the students when they did the walkout in Farmville. And they told how, you know, they taught the classes in their homes, in basements, in churches, so that they could continue that education. And we even have a book in our museum, Through the Eyes of a Child. One of the students that attended R.R. Moten, and they lived in the county. Their parents, it's a beautiful story. If you get to read the book, I could talk about it because it will make you cry, because as a child, they had to learn to go to a different school. They had to learn how to, you know, their parents came up with a way for them to come to Appomattox and get their education. Mr. Berryman was one of those ones that shared the story with us, how they picked a house. And it's a true story. They picked a house. It only started out with 2 kids, and the next thing they know, that bus was filled up with children from in the community, and they had a full bus load coming to Appomattox. But you know, when you think about it, you know, Prince Edward, Appomattox, Cumberland, all of us kind of, you know, came together, but our parents, you know, made sure that, you know, your education is important. I mean, it's a lot. We could talk all day about the different schools, you know, coming together. I mean, it's just so much because a lot of people really don't know, and the only reason I got to know is because my sister-in-law was one of those ones that did the walkout, and she talked about it, and you could tell how some of them didn't like to talk about it because it was a hurt, it was a void there. And, you know, people, like she would say, people looked at you like, did you really go through that? You know, and, you know, it's hard to get younger people to understand that those are the things that our parents before us had to go through, and it's important for us to continue that education. It's not something that we could take for granted. You know, it was hard for them to get it, and here it is for us. You know, they paved the way for us to get it.
It was, if I can
Yeah.
take it. It was a little different for us in southwestern part of Virginia. Of course, if you know anything about southwestern part of Virginia, you know it's not very many blacks down there at all. And we didn't know anything about schools closing. We didn't know anything about it. And myself, in the 7th grade, after the 7th grade, you graduated from the 7th grade from the Rosenwald School, we were bused to Bristol, Virginia. And, you know, and Bristol is like, it's Tennessee side and there's a Virginia side. So we were bused to the Virginia side, like 30 miles after graduating from that school. And like I remember, I said that we could walk to school. We was bused 30 miles, you know, every day practically. And that was my 8th grade. In the 9th grade, we integrated. So in '64, I went to Douglas. The second semester, they came in and said, next year, y'all be going to school with white people. And that's how we found out. That's how we found out. And you know, some of us were glad about it. All of us, you know, everybody wasn't glad about it. And you know, it wasn't anybody standing out in front of the school or anything when we went. And I meant to start this with my next door neighbor till I started to elementary school, the Rosenwald School, was white. It's a white family. And we, you know, I could walk to school. I live right next door to the school, so I could walk to school. He caught a bus and went to school. And after school, we got together and played.
Yeah.
You know, I could go to his house. He could come to my house. We would eat and stuff. And that was just the kid that happened to be my age there. But after, you know, after we started going to school, you know, it separated, you know. And my thing, I think of that as that we didn't fully integrate. It was sort of assimilation. As long as we were in our place, there was no problem, you know. But you know, you try to step out there. Even the music that we played, you know, was different. But when you like 35, 65 out of 800 students, you know, and you know, so it was difficult, you know, and then I don't want to get on that, but you know, it was, you know, like I played football, and so what I was experiencing was different from what the other kids were. And then when, you know, if the other kids would come and tell me like the kind of things that they were going through, well, I wasn't going through that, you know, as long as I was playing football. You know,
Huh.
so. Then I got hurt playing football, then it got a little different.
Our parents made those ways for, you know, some of us to play sports. Coach Lewis told a story, and I didn't think it was real, but I was one of them ones that, like, for real. But, they would talk to the farmers. If there were certain students that were really good, they would take another student and say, hey, let this student work the crops so that this student can, play basketball. We had one particular person, Larry Robinson. He was so good, his father and my father worked the thing out, and they got a couple more students come down and help with the tobacco so that Larry could play football and basketball. And I was like, really? I was like, you have to think about the things, that did take place back then, like Joe Trisha was talking about, from slavery up till now. It was a lot that, that we went through, the struggles, the challenges, and it's still there somewhat.
And for those of you who work with students today, how do today's young people react to these stories?
They think you're lying.
Yeah. They just
They do, because they don't
understand.
because, and I'm not even gonna say students, because I'm 51, and I have conversation with my family member who are older, and it gets into this, I know my experience is not as bad as my mom and my dad's, and I know it's not as bad as my grandparent and my great-grandparent. But when I talk about the discrimination and the struggles, they go like, it doesn't exist. And I was like, it doesn't exist how you experienced it. But what we experience is the same. The act or the behavior may have changed a little bit, but the name is still the same. And that's what I try to teach kids, because they learn bits and pieces. I volunteer with an organization that works a lot with children, and I had to have a conversation with African American boys because they were using some derogatory language towards other African American boys. And I was like, do you even know what that means? And they were going like, that's a good thing. That just means, I won't say it, but they were going like, you're just, that just means you just work in the field. And I was going like, that's a lot more meaning. And I think it's really, and it goes back to education. It doesn't, I'm not going to say that I think it's a collaboration between home, community, and school. No successful community is unless there's a collaboration between all of the moving parts. And they live in a world where everything is instant gratification, that they don't recognize. But there's also a flip side, especially here, because there is a divide. We want to talk about the elephant in the room. There is a divide. So you do have people who constantly think this is why this is happening, and then other people going like it doesn't happen. But I think it's just nobody wants to talk about it like that. I always get frustrated when people go like, we need to unify, we need to unite. But what are we unifying for? Because I know what I want may not be what Lou wants.
So Lou, how do you engage your students and have conversations with them? Or is there something that you've found that has been helpful in?
Well, I always try to bring things back to why we're here, content, and something that's really relevant to education is, well, the reality is that whether it's today, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the amount of money that you're going to make is dependent upon your education, the opportunity, skills you acquire through experience and, well, education. And this all gets down to who had the opportunity for education. So before the Civil War, well, it was only whites who had an opportunity for education. Laws passed that made it so it was illegal for somebody who was enslaved or a free African American to go to school. Okay, so that meant who had control, who had the economic upper hand generation. Okay, so it was the same plantation owning families that were in control, whether it be governmentally or economically. Well, Union victory in the Civil War, that changed that. That's where we started to see the first public schools. And who were the ones who were making that happen? Whether it's through the Virginia Constitutional Convention in 1867, 1868, or the folks in the Virginia Senate and the House of Delegates during Reconstruction shortly after. Well, it was those who were formerly enslaved, or free African Americans before the Civil War with the ability to hold public office. These were the lawmakers that were making public education happen. And then some of them were teachers themselves. Some of, in many instances, it was their children and grandchildren that were doing the work. So these are the individuals that were legislatively making it happen, but also doing the work after the fact. Whether it's Shed Dungy, who was elected in Cumberland County shortly after Reconstruction, his granddaughter would be one of the first principals at Cumberland Training School. And then, Frank Moss, he was one of the 15 individuals in the Virginia Constitutional Convention where there was an item to ban segregation, but this is 1867. April 8th, 1867, where there's a resolution to ban segregation. He was one of 15, along with Samuel Kelso from Campbell County, who voted in favor of banning segregation. Now, it was 1867, so it was denied 56 to 15, but Frank Moss later was elected state senate and represented part of Appomattox County. So, but the point is that this gets the importance of education, educational opportunity, and even though it's widely documented the inequities in education, especially during segregation, the amount of fundraising, whether you're talking about money, time, everything going into it to try to make up for that funding gap. I could go on, but really I don't have so much time.
I'd like to mention something as well, because going back to, actually this was around the first question that I was thinking about back before, back to 1865, somewhere along that time after Lincoln was assassinated, after he did the, and Johnson, I'm forgetting his first name, but Johnson became president after the assassination. And he was a Southerner, so he didn't have a lot of the same beliefs that Lincoln did. And one of the things that he did was he took and passed law or whatever, how you do that, the Freedom Bureau, he took the funding away from them. So that was the start of the Freeman's Bureau decline, although it took several years. But what they were able to do at the first part of that time was in my opinion, and what reading was great. And that's when the decline started, and eventually, of course, they closed the doors. But that's when it changed.
All right. And I know at Moton, y'all are telling a story at Carver Price, the historical marker that was put up for Glade Springs. These are all examples of telling the story of the importance of education and what Black Americans have had to struggle against to acquire that. But right now, I'm going to open it up to the audience and let you guys ask some questions of our panelists.
Yes, I have a question, and my question is today, just knowing how important it was to Rosenwald to build these schools for African-American children to be educated. In the climate of today, how do we get our congressmen, our town council members, and just people in our society, period, to know and understand the importance of education and how important it is for us to educate our children in the communities? I see a lot of decline in public education, and I'm not sure if it's because of lack of funding or lack of community involvement. I just want to know your thoughts on it, because it was very important for Rosenwald to decide we have to educate the African American community to build them up, to make them equal in society. And like you said, you can see where there was that importance, but then is there a decline in it now?
I think there's a lot of moving pieces. I think part of the decline in education, my soapbox, my opinion, nobody else's. I think when they went to those state testing SOLs, that where the decline went, because prior to that, and when I was going to school, teachers were able to make the curriculum to fit the class. Teachers could take the opportunity to say, oh, this group is a little behind, this group is a little advanced, let us work it out. Now, I know a lot of teachers are working the schools, but I do know, like, hey, you got to get to this subject by the end of this 9 weeks, you got to get to this by the end of this 9 weeks. So it doesn't leave a lot. So I think that's one thing. I think also involvement. There's not a lot of parent involvement in the relationships with schools. I don't, and I think that has to do with a lot of things. You know, having to work longer hours, this, that, and the other. So I don't think like parents are necessarily saying I don't care. It's just, it's not there. And then you have, I think that's kind of part of it. And I do think it's who we elect. Are we doing our research about who we're elected to put in place to make decisions for us? Because I think that also dictates who's going to be having on the Department of Education, who's going to be on the Budget and Finance Committee. So I think it's kind of moving pieces, but I also think that I see that African Americans, we have to go back to feeling like pride and a sense of excellence. I feel like that kind of gets missed because of things that are happening. You know, you've kind of gotten beaten down. I think sometimes it's just, why should we keep trying? But I like what he said, and I tell people all the time, if you're going to advocate for change, if you're going to stand for something, this isn't a sprint. This is a lifelong journey. If you're going to stand beside me, behind me, in front of me, whenever it needs to be, this ain't something that you're going to go like, hey, this was cool this year, but not. If you're going to be my ally, we're gonna be in here till we don't breathe anymore. So I feel like that's kind of the component, and I think unless African Americans show up, the rest of the world ain't gonna recognize that we're important. If we don't value us, why is anybody else gonna value us? And I think that's where we start. And then once people see we are standing our ground, that we're important, then I think people feel comfortable. Because I have heard the comment in certain places that, oh, why should we worry about it? They don't care about it. So I think that's where we start. And I'll show up at the meetings, board of supervisors, town council, school board meetings, any kind, every entity has, all meetings are public. You don't have to say a word, but I guarantee you, if everybody starts showing up.
I think, and to piggyback on her about that, that's actually true. Because we as African Americans, we drop the ball to a certain point because we don't come out to these meetings to find out what's going on. We don't sign up to express what's going on in our community. As far as we as a whole, a lot of the churches own some of these Rosenwald schools. And we forget to tell that part of the history. You know, a lot of the people that know the history are no longer here.
Right.
So we do have to do that homework, is to get that history. Like this young lady here was asking the question how she could find out about the school. You know, you do. You go down to the school board, you go down to your board of supervisors. There are records there. You're going to have to dig, but that information is there. It's a lot of work. And I tell anybody, it's not easy, even for the Carver Price Legacy Museum, the R.R. Logan. Those people put in a lot of work and time, you know, and it's also up to, as parents, sisters and brothers, cousins, next door neighbors. I mean, because I grew up, I was in an all-white neighborhood. You know, they knew some of the information better than we did, you know, but it's up to us to make that difference. We need to keep that history going.
And then I'll add to it as well. I always think about Septima Clark when I think about education and access. Her entire focus was, I'm gonna teach you how to read. Great, now you can teach you how to be a citizen. People don't know they can't show up to meetings. They don't know that they are active agents in their own life. So that basic tenets of you're a citizen, what do you want to see in your community? Okay, great, how are you gonna do it? And then mutual aid, like we help each other. That's how we survived so long. But then expand it a little bit, because our world's different too. You see a need, you can fix it, we'll just fix it, that kind of thing. So I think a mix of knowledge and then an expectation of, oh, I didn't see you at the meeting, what's going on? Are you good? Like, I'll see you next week, that kind of thing.
I think we've got, Rod?
This is for Lou, and it just builds on something Joe Trish said. So in your classroom, from a teacher point of view, how much latitude do you have on adding to the state mandated curriculum? For instance, what we learned here tonight, the importance of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Is that part of the state's curriculum? If not, do you
Short answer, yes.
to explain?
Short answer, yes. This is in the state standards. And because we, about 10 some odd years ago, right around the time I went from civics economics to U.S. History 2, not so coincidentally, was because there wasn't an SOL test there. And there's encouragement from Regina, part of education, to delve in a little bit deeper because there isn't an SOL test. You don't have to memorize a bunch of stuff if there's no SOL test at the end of the year, which most of the students will probably forget 2 or 3 weeks after they take the SOL test. So the pushes, performance assessments, using primary sources. From the time period, I wasn't alive then. Students' parents and maybe grandparents were not alive during the time periods we're talking about. So let's go with the primary sources and put an emphasis on that. And whatever the students see from primary sources, that's their argument in the assessments. In many units, some units we have a multiple choice test, but many of them it's a performance assessment where they just get sources and they have a big question to answer, and however they answer it, that's something, but they got to back it up with sources. But as far as digging into this content, excuse me, we've done a variety of projects. I was going to mention a little bit later, I do have sheets with QR codes with some of the various student assignments that they've done over the last couple of years. They've written articles for Cardinal News. There's been story markers that have gone up through their work. Last summer school, there was a group that created a story map. They mapped every African-American school in Cumberland County. And that's just one of the assignments from last summer school. So if anybody's interested in taking a look at that, I've got a few sheets with QR codes up here. But no, I mean, a lot of it is what the division that you're working in tells you to do or what not to do. But I've been fortunate to teach at Cumberland County Public Schools for a little over 20 years, and I've got a supportive administration, and we're encouraged to do what's best for our students.
And I saw,
I'm sorry. And I would just say this is an exceptional teacher. He really is. Like I said, I coach golf at Cumberland, and his students, and sometimes I don't know that there's been students of his, and they start to tell me all the things about that he does or that he'll do for them and stuff. I find it amazing. I mean, it's like, so he's exception to the rules.
But the Virginia Board of Education limit how much African American history is taught in public schools. Like, you think about the pride that would come in Prince Edward County if they knew, if those children knew all of this information. I'm 56 years old. I'm a product, my mother was a product of the schools closing. We never heard anything about the schools closing when I was in school. I got all that information from her. So is there a responsibility from the Virginia Department of Education to teach history, and are they willing to do it?
I know some of the standards, Barbara Johns has been added, and to me, Barbara Johns is the gateway to talk about the schools being closed. If you come to Moton, we're going to talk about both, because it's the same story, it's 2 different chapters. And I know 4th grade, 7th grade, 11th grade, and we scaffold change how we talk about it, but it's all being discussed. And depending on once people can get to Moton or how they get to us kind of way, yes, and we have teachers from all over trying to get this history. So it's in the standards, but it's the luxury of access and then admin support.
All right, and I saw one,
Can I make a comment? I taught in Prince Edward County Schools for 34 years. My husband did not go to school until he was 10 years old because he's from Prince Edward County. I had a former student that wrote a wonderful book about Prince Edward County Schools. He had to jump through hoops, he had to beg, he had to meet, he had to advocate, he had to do all those things before the school board would even give him a meeting about his book. So when it comes to the African American student in Prince Edward County right now, it's sad. It's a sad situation. And I'm not making this up. Like you said, when people say all that stuff made up, I could tell you stories, because I walk the walk, but I'm still gonna talk the talk, because I owe it to those children to give them my best. Even though I've been retired for 19 years, I still owe it to them to give them my best. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you.
I
There's-
actually harder than what I'm called.
Well, I think that's a good statement, that there's still work that needs to be done. And
And you know, I'll add to that is churches, you know, churches need to step up.
Yes.
Some of the pastors of the churches, they need to step up. And that's black, white, whatever, you know, is some of those pastors, those churches, and what's being taught, because the future of public school systems is on the line. It's on the line.
I think that is an excellent way to end, because we are a little over time. But I think these are all things that need to be talked about and need to be acted upon. Thank you all for coming out and showing your interest and your support. And thank you to those of you who agreed to be on the panel and discuss these important issues today. And if anybody, I know there were a few that probably didn't get a chance to ask questions, go up and ask one of the panelists what's on your mind.